All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here tonight. I thought on a snowy April day, we would have 5 or 10 people here. But I think it's a testament to the power of the conversation and our incredible speakers tonight. I'm Dina Mansour. I'm the Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. And thank you for coming this evening to the Mansfield Dialogue on U.S. Liberation Day trade policies, what they have achieved, and at what cost. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to honor our nation's longest-serving Senate Majority Leader and his focus on ethics and public affairs, as well as our longest-serving U.S. Ambassador to Japan, who had a focus at that time on international engagement, especially with Asia. Our dialogue tonight is one in a continuing series of conversations designed to engage our global community. We have about 133 people online tonight, as well as about 40 people in the audience here. So global community engaging on that dual mission of ethics and public affairs, democracy, and international engagement. So we'll begin the conversation with our 2 speakers, and then we'll turn it over to questions alternating between the room and the online audience. So I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Dr. Kristin Vekasi is our inaugural Mansfield Chair of Japanese and Indo-Pacific Studies. She joined us here at the university in August. Her work focuses on trade and investment strategies in changing geopolitical environments and the political risk management of supply chains. She specializes in Northeast Asia and has spent years conducting research in China, Japan, and South Korea. We also have Bryce Ward. He's a former member of the Mansfield Advisory Board. He's the founder of ABMJ Consulting and a research associate at the Rural Institute here at the University of Montana. He has a PhD in economics from Harvard University and BAs in economics and history from the University of Oregon. He has expertise in a range of issues within the field of economics, including labor, health, social, public finance, natural resource economics. So thank you both for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I am excited to talk tariffs and trade and politics this evening. So to take us back a little over a year now, on April 2nd of 2025, it was billed as Liberation Day for the United States. And on that afternoon, President Trump stood in the Rose Garden, and next to him he had this large placard, and on that placard it was labeled reciprocal tariffs. And these taxes on trade, these tariffs, were set up at a high baseline for all countries and territories in the world, and it had higher rates for about 30 countries, almost up to about 50%. So for example, poor Cambodia was threatened with a tariff rate of 49%. So these tariffs did mark a major shift in U.S. trade policy. Prior to some of the current trade tariff turbulence, average tariff rates in the United States were hovering around 2% or below, right? They're very, very low. And then beginning in early 2025, the United States imposed broad tariffs on imports from China, as well as products related to the fentanyl trade, and there were sort of some sector by sector and country by country things. But then this reciprocal tariff announcement in early April was a major, just global acceleration of a new trade approach. Now, what was the argument for this, right? And we'll get into the real nitty-gritty as we go on. But the Trump administration argued that countries were not providing fair access to their markets, and that long-standing trade imbalances, where the United States imported far more goods than most trade partners than they exported, harmed American workers, and it harmed American industries and American manufacturing. So with these Liberation Day tariffs, we had 3 main goals: reducing the U.S. trade deficit, maybe even exporting more than we import, raising government revenue through tariffs, and then bringing back manufacturing capacity to the United States. Now, days after April 2nd, after some really extreme market turbulence and public outcry, largely from people losing money through market turbulence, tariff levels were adjusted again. They were paused, and most countries hovered between 10 and 15%. Some were a little bit higher. China was certainly higher. And this was a pause, and this pause was followed by negotiations with trading partners, leading to a series of bilateral frameworks, occasionally multi or minilateral framework deals that adjusted tariff rates and included commitments on things, purchase agreements, investment agreements, purchases of US goods, things like this. Now, the plot thickened and continued. In May of 2025, the US Court of International Trade ruled that this was not legal, that the Trump administration had overstepped its authority using tariffs through what was called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. And then this February 2026, the US Supreme Court agreed. And so these tariffs, which companies have already paid $166 billion, much of which was passed on to consumers, just weren't legal. And so here we are, right? A little over a year later, trade policy during these weeks has changed over 50 times. There's just been extreme turbulence. And we've just been on a really wild tariff ride over the last year. So now that we're here, we have a little bit of perspective. What happened? Why did it happen? Where are we now? And so what we're going to start sort of at a high level, thinking about these issues, and then dig into some evaluation and before we turn it over to questions. I'll turn to Bryce. What's happened, right, since Liberation Day? How much did tariffs actually increase? How far outside historical norms are we? Like, right, where are we now?
We're exhausted. So like the late night comedians, after they come back from like when they've been on vacation, they like do a summary of all the crazy things that have happened in the weeks that they've been gone. So I was gonna try and do that, like with all the things. So I had my AI assistant, Claude, make a list of every time that Trump threatened a tariff, imposed a tariff, paused a tariff, delayed a tariff, rescinded a tariff, or whether the courts ruled against him. Anybody wanna guess how many items are on this list? 90, right? So I can't do that. That would be all of our time. But the point is that we've gone through a lot, right? And the first order effect of all of this is that uncertainty has increased, right? So that's the first thing, the main thing that has changed today relative to where we were 12 or 14 months ago, is that uncertainty about all things trade related are much, much higher. Right? Even the current tariffs that we have, that we got after the Supreme Court got rid of the IEEPA tariffs, Trump immediately imposed new tariffs that are almost identical in terms of total value as the ones that got thrown away. Now that changed who has what tariffs, but like roughly 80% of the tariffs collected under the old regime will be collected under the current regime. Now, Section 122 tariffs, which are the new tariffs, they expire after 150 days. So these will presumably go away in July, but who knows? So the first order effect is that uncertainty has increased. But even just within the narrow world of trade, a lot has changed, right? There's some gray hair in the audience. But even amongst the gray hairs in the audience, we are very likely under the highest tariff regime of your lifetime. We are roughly at the levels that existed in the 1940s. So that's a big change in terms of average effective tariff rates. But even more important is, in the 1940s, we didn't import very much, right? So if you look at tariff revenue as a share of GDP, it is at historical highs by a large margin, right? So tariffs are a much bigger deal in our economy than they have been, again, throughout anybody in this room's life, for the most part. So that's a big change, right? Now, the next order effect that we talk about with tariffs is, well, who's paying them, right? You know, are we just collecting money from a bunch of foreigners that are, you know, $156 billion of government revenue that were, you know, it's like the Montana towns that have the tourist tax that get to collect taxes on outsiders. Is that all we have here? No, that's not what's going on. There's been several studies of this. The current tariff regime, 90% is being paid by American companies or consumers. Right? So that means roughly, it's different estimates have different levels, but $1,000 to $1,500 per household. Right? So that's how much we've increased your taxes. And that counts the tax portion, right, that's being paid. But we actually don't collect direct taxes on the fact that if I'm a domestic company and my import competitor has to now pay higher tariffs, I get to raise my prices, right? So there's just this roughly 1 percentage point increase in the price level due to tariffs. Different estimates get that slightly differently, but that's in a world where we're already complaining about the cumulative effects of inflation over the past, since in the 20s, an additional percentage point is large, meaningful, noticeable. So those are the kind of the main effects that we've seen, right? So we have this massive increase in uncertainty. We get most of it is passed through to Americans. We get relative changes in prices, right? So you get some shifts in economic activity across the economy. It's hard to isolate exactly, but if you're in construction and mining, this has been very bad for you. And it doesn't appear to have been successful at achieving the manufacturing renaissance that it was set out to do. And then I'm assuming I'll throw this back to you, but it's not just that we're doing this, right? Like when we put tariffs on people, they respond, right? And they respond by increasing the tariffs on us. So the tariffs that our exporters are paying are also at highs for anybody in this room's lifetime. But more importantly, it's not just that they're reciprocating on tariffs on us. They're basically just saying, go away, right? They're making trade agreements amongst each other, right? Saying that we're just going to go without you, right? Which is a loss of both power and influence, but it's also a loss of market opportunity that will persist for the long haul. So that's at a high level what's happened so far. We can get much deeper into the weeds of all of that, but we've definitely changed the world relative to where we were a year ago.
One of the things that's really struck me as the level of uncertainty has increased at, I think at Davos at the World Economic Forum this year. There's the word of the year is uncertainty, and things like this. Is that many regions and countries have tried to keep the door open for the United States. And for example, Japan is a major, as an ally, a major trading partner of the United States, and has negotiated rather than retaliated. And that in part shows the importance of the United States, like for Japan, for South Korea, for countries like that, but also shows, I think, is an indication of that the trading system that the United States really was instrumental in building after World War II, after the Cold War, in the 90s, in the aughts, has been really beneficial for billions of people around the world in ways. And right now there's, sort of lighting a match to some of the institutions, and the patterns that we have has effects, of course, right here in the United States, which we can get into a little bit more, but also in all of these places. And right now, at this moment, countries are moving on, and they're also still holding the door open for us, which I think is quite remarkable, frankly, given the amount of volatility that we've seen. I also wanted to circle back to something you said about how this is really unprecedented. And I think we had this hyper age of globalization a little over 100 years ago. And in some ways, the world is less globalized now in terms of finance and people moving than it was right before World War I. But at the same time, the way that we manufacture now is so fragmented that it doesn't really matter if you are a company that just manufactures in the United States or even just in Montana and sells to Montanans. You're still in interconnected and integrated into these supply chains. And so the effects of these tariffs have so many different ripple effects, downstream from the inputs, from the labor, from all of the different parts that are going on. So in some ways, even a year, it's not nearly enough time to assess what's going on.
We definitely haven't seen the full effects, in part because it's all uncertain, right? Everybody keeps thinking it's going to go away. And in fact, the Section 122 tariffs will go away in July, right? Assuming unless Congress reauthorizes them. But but at that point, we'll probably see more Section 230, which the national Section 122 is a made-up thing that. You guys remember when we had the gold standard? Right. So in the early 70s, we were still on the gold standard, and there was concerns about what are known as balance of payments, right? How much dollars are in other people's hands that they could show up at our doors and say, you have to give me, I think it was 0.35 ounces of gold per dollar or something. I don't remember what it was. And so they wrote this law saying, okay, you have the authority to adjust the terms of trade to try and keep the balance of payments in order. Here's this law, which has sat dormant for 52 years until what was the day the Supreme Court ruled?
May something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
February 26th, I think. Yeah. And suddenly now we have 10% tariffs on literally every country in the world under this thing that was designed to deal with balance of payments. So it may get thrown out by the courts as well, but regardless, it does expire after 150 days. But we've changed the world in ways that are hard to get your head around. I've lost my point, so I'll stop there.
So when we look forward right now, in order to put there's these different sections of trade law that allow presidents to put tariffs on countries for national security purposes. So you might think of something like we need to put trade protection on a particular input so we can make tanks or drones, or in order to maintain our defense readiness, or something that you can define as national security. And in order to do that, you're supposed to do an investigation. There's time for public feedback. There's time for industry negotiation and that sort of thing. And then you can put these new tariffs on. And these tariffs have been used like steel and aluminum in the first Trump administration. They've been used historically against countries that we were having more economic disputes with, like Japan, and say, this is a national security thing. We're going to use these national security tariffs because they're easier to implement. But you do need to have these investigations. So right now, in USTR, U.S. Trade Representative Office, and probably the Department of Commerce, there's a lot of people really, really busily doing those investigations in order to implement those tariffs as of July 24th. But they're going to be product specific rather than just this blanket thing. And we had some things come out in the early of last year where garlic was under a national security tariff, and we're going to see a lot of things like that that will give scholars decades and decades of interesting research to do, but of how things get securitized. But that's what's happening right now. And so it will be in some ways a more complicated, I think, landscape come midsummer.
Yeah.
So let's. We are going to go through some of these effects, but let's dive in a little bit more into the goals of the tariffs, because when we look at the United States in the last couple of decades, there are reasons to complain about the economy, and there are reasons to complain about globalization, and the response of an administration to say, well, we're going to try and use trade policy in order to respond to the hollowing out of manufacturing, the hollowing out of some communities that have just lost all of their jobs, lost all of this economic activity. That's real, and so this is not a fabricated thing. So let's talk a little bit about this. And do you want to?
Sure. I mean, when you think about why is this happening, and if you go through this list of things, there's three buckets. right? So the first two buckets are related. There's the economic and political justifications, right? And those are kind of, trade creates diffuse benefits, so we all benefit a little bit, right? And concentrated costs, right? So there's a factory that used to be able to supply this thing, and now we import it from China because it's way cheaper. And so that factory and those workers are adversely affected. Now, 300 million of us get the benefits of everything being a little bit cheaper. And it turns out that that's a much bigger number than the cost to that community. But most of us, how many of you have a mental calculus of the prices that you would have paid in a world without the certain trade agreements that we have in place? I'm guessing you don't, right? So you have no understanding of just how much you've benefited. You maybe have some loose understanding that, yeah, there just seems to be more stuff at the store than there used to be, and it's a lot cheaper to buy some things than it used to be, but you don't have a mental calculation of just how many thousands of dollars that you've benefited. But it's really easy to point at a town and say, look at the factory that's all boarded up, and look at the opioid epidemic that swept through that community, and say, well, trade is bad, right? So there's this popular argument that trade can be bad, and maybe it's the balance of has shifted against it. Now, it's not a majority position. Most Americans are still on board with trade, but there was
Large
a certain
majorities.
Yeah, but there certainly is political hay to be made from demonizing trade, and saying we should, Trump's initial CEA guy, Stephen Myron. He wrote this article literally, which is kind of the economic backdrop to all of this, the alleged economic backdrop. And it's titled something like, a simple proposal to reshape global trade. And I won't get into the weeds of it, but, essentially the idea of it was the US is a loser in this system, right? Essentially, we're the reserve currency. And because we're the reserve currency, everybody wants dollars, they buy a lot of our bonds, and so the exchange rate is unfavorable to us, and other countries manipulate it, and so our exporters can't compete, particularly our manufacturing exporters, and so we're suffering, and we need to reshape this whole system in ways that will allow us to revive manufacturing. Despite the fact that manufacturing has been declining for a long time, it's declining in countries that even are not us. And what it ignores entirely is that we get enormous benefits from being the reserve currency, right? Like when you guys go buy a mortgage, the interest rate on that mortgage is lower because we're the reserve currency, right? So, there's a lot of kind of economic justifications that are built around, and I don't know if you want me to go through the whole thing, but I won't. But it's fundamentally about we're getting a raw deal. But there's a slight variable that's also involved in this, which is that Donald Trump is a mercantilist. He does not understand, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, right? Which is, economists, we get a bad rap. We're the dismal science. I used to know why that we're called that, but I've forgotten. But it's always, we're about money and markets and all this stuff. But no, day one of economics, you learn that economics is about scarcity, right? And fundamentally what economists want to do is we want to resolve scarcity. We want to make it so that you're not feeling the effects of scarcity as much. And one of the initial insights of modern economics was, how you do that? You cooperate. Cooperation is the key to prosperity. And trade is just cooperation on an international scale. But the mercantilists, who this was a response to, they believe that, no, prosperity comes from basically exporting more than you import, right? So Donald Trump sees a trade deficit, and he thinks that we're losing. Now, economists will tell you that a trade deficit is just an accounting identity, and it has an exact opposite accounting identity, right? So we call it the current account. There's this thing called the capital account. And you know where we're, quote, winning? Foreigners are investing in American assets. So as long as foreigners want to buy American assets, almost automatically we will have a trade deficit that is almost exactly equal to the net import of finance that we get. And so none of this attempts to rebalance global trade. The only way to do that is to say to foreigners, we do not want you to buy our assets anymore. And you know the number one asset that they buy? It's treasury bonds. You know, what are treasury bonds for? It's for us not wanting to pay taxes for the goods and services the government provides us, right? So this is all linked, right? Like, you know, this is where trade blows your mind, right? Is that when Congress says we want to have a budget deficit, they're basically saying we want to have a trade deficit. It's all linked together, right? And so when you're saying we want to reshape the whole global economy, that's great, but we should probably have a real intense, deliberative process about the real trade-offs, the benefits and costs. And are we willing to say, yeah, we're going to lower our budget deficit, we're going to save more and consume less so that we have a lower trade deficit, which might change the terms of trade, which might change, you know, whether or not we can export manufacturing and employ some workers who lost their jobs 20 years ago.
Right. I mean, it's one of the things, there's community-based arguments for manufacturing jobs. And that one of the things that we've seen with trade is that it is not evenly geographically distributed, right? So in particular, there's a lot of really great research done on when the sort of flood of Chinese imports started to come into the United States after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And some places, in fact, in Montana, Chinese imports didn't affect local industry very much. Where I used to live in Maine, there were certain industries that just disappeared as a result of exposure to Chinese imports. Through sort of the Rust Belt, Sun Belt, there's really deep effects. And so some places, you know, are you know, get this like a slap in the face, and some places really, you know, really sort of got some of the benefits, right? These diffuse benefits without as much of many of these really acute costs, particularly with trade exposure to China. But if we really want to take this question seriously of domestic manufacturing is important. We would like to have domestic manufacturing because then we can respond to crises, because then we can, you know, we can couple innovation with the manufacturing process, which arguably leads to, you know, better products, better entrepreneurship, better innovation and invention down the line. And if we want to do that, we have to think about exactly like what policy mechanisms might be the best way to do it. And tariffs are a really tough tool in that case, because tariffs, we can adjust to tariffs. For example, countries will use, you know, trade diversification or trade diversion methods in order to, well, you know, you're not going to buy from that country. Why don't we just sell it through this other country, and we could go around in another direction. Or just sort of the weight of comparative advantage and set supply chains and set partnerships is really, really hard to use through this taxation mechanism. And so there are maybe alternative policy mechanisms that we can think about, but just thinking about manufacturing jobs and this very, I think, compelling argument that trade policy can be used that way. In one year out, we're down somewhat 90,000 manufacturing jobs, and we're paying a lot more for manufactured goods. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's. I stopped being a trade economist because trade breaks your brain, right? Like, it's really simple at first, right? Like, oh, you know, we have a comparative advantage in this, you have a comparative advantage, we should trade, and you can see the pie gets bigger. Awesome, great. Right, but then you get into international macro and international finance, and you're like, oh, wait a second, well, this changes the terms of trade, changes the exchange rate, that changes interest rates, and that changes financial markets. And so when you're trying to work through that mechanism to then try and say, we're going to create more manufacturing jobs in this location, it's a Rube Goldberg machine that has to go perfectly right for it to have the impact at the end, right? Versus the alternative, which is, okay, let's just have industrial policy. If we're really concerned about this, let's, you know, create the CHIPS Act or something where you say, look, we're just going to directly invest in, you know, and manufacturing is important. We are behind in manufacturing. We need to be more, it turns out that when you make things, that's how you figure out how to create better things. And so we need to have more people making things in the United States so that we can continue to be on the cutting edge of figuring out how to make them better. And in particular, there are things that if there were a World War III were to break out, we could be in a lot of trouble, right? So we want to make sure that, yeah, we meet our national, but it's an insurance policy, right? You're basically saying, I'm going to accept slightly lower prosperity in exchange for mitigating this risk, right? And so, yeah, you can use Section 232, the national defense tariffs, to help you along that way in some limited fashion. But for the most part, you just have to say, we're going to do policies that are designed to move the needle on this thing. And we know that when we push it, it's not going to, all of that energy of pushing it isn't going to end up leaking out into some exchange rate change that has entirely different winners and losers than what we're trying to target. I forgot one of the reasons that we started with this with why did we do this, right? So that's the economic political vision. But in the hands of this president administration, literally the number one, the first, anybody want to, after the day one executive order, what was the first tariff-related activity? Trump threatens Colombia with 25% tariffs over deportation flight dispute. A lot of how we're using tariffs under this administration is as a foreign policy tool. It's power over. We can try and use this as a tool to create power imbalances, not to achieve higher revenues or improve manufacturing, although, again, if you work through the whole math, those are contradictory, so you can't achieve both at the same time. But it's also a means of trying to, literally try and get Greenland into the United States. I'm sure that's in here somewhere, because we did. So that's why we're doing it, right? We're doing it allegedly to rebalance trade in ways that are going to improve our economy and scratch a political itch or achieve some foreign policy goal. Can I take us to the next thing? Yeah. All right. Is it likely to do any of this? How do we evaluate this going forward, right? Not looking backward, but looking forward. Are we going to be able to achieve these ends? Are these even the right ends to achieve? And are we going to end up, who are the winners and losers, and are we going to end up in a better place?
Indeed, are we going to end up in a better place? It's when we think about this. I mean, we've already in some ways answered this question. So if you take the things like, well, we'd like tariffs to be a source of revenue, and maybe that can even offset, so we can lower income taxes. But if you also want the tariffs and trade policy to increase manufacturing, and then that would replace that, and then that means the tariffs are going to go down, and these would eventually be policies that cancel each other out. Which one is the goal? There was talk early on in getting rid of the Internal Revenue Service, so we just have an External Revenue Service, and we would be able to fund the government on tariffs alone. It's a good thing we didn't do that, because now it would all be getting refunded to the companies. We would no longer have a budget. We'd have to sell more bonds, But all of that aside, and so there's the manufacturing question. There's also this national security, this national security question. So I think one of the ways to think of that I like to think about this in terms of the United States' place in the world is that President Trump is somewhat inconsistent on some policy things, but he's really consistent on trade. And he's been consistent on trade since the 1980s. And this is a place when he was the Republican nominee in 2016, there was this great article in this Japanese magazine called Economist, Economist. And it had all of these quotes and just this long track record of this is exactly how Trump sees Japan and also sees trade. And he's been really consistent on that. And one of those huge things is tariffs, of course, and the balance of trade is sort of the scorecard. But another thing that really has carried over, and we see this now, is this focus on well, the tariff levels might be low, but we're getting screwed over in other ways through regulations and unfair testing and non-tariff barriers and all of these things. And when I look through all these framework agreements that the Trump administration has made with now 17 different countries or regions, including the EU. Much of what's in there is language about, eliminating testing for U.S. automobiles to enter the domestic market. And there's these things that I recognize from reading, especially about Japan, but also the EU and political disputes. Oh, this is long-term beef here. Beef is also a big one that comes up, in fact. Yes, but very, very Montana relevant. But these are really like long-term issues, and many of them have been already resolved, and now there's this written record of it. But this is, I mean, I think this is a place where if we wanted to look for sort of a face-saving exit from a trade war, that some of these non-tariff barriers have been at least, verbally and in these non-legal agreement frameworks, there's been some movement there.
Yeah,
Optimistic take.
Look, as somebody whose undergraduate thesis was entitled "Occupational Licensing as a Non-Tariff Barrier to Trade," I'm all about non-tariff barriers, and I certainly understand that not everything that restricts access to markets is, tariffs. But I also understand that we have these very complicated trade agreements that have been negotiated over decades where they're trying to essentially balance all this out. And look, we can all identify our favorite problem with our existing system, right? But when I look at our existing system in terms of it has produced greater prosperity than any system in the history of the world. As much as Americans like to complain, Americans' material well-being standards the data are very clear. You are living in the golden age, right? Income inequality has been falling this decade. Median household income is the highest it's ever been. Obviously, our national income is as high as it's ever been. So look, I'm open to the idea, the notion that there are many, many problems within this system. But I'm also fundamentally conservative and we have this. This is okay, right? We can try and improve it, but we should be thinking very, very hard about what's lurking, I mean, it didn't materialize because we quickly rescinded the tariffs on all trade from Mexico and Canada. But one of the arguments that I had read when all that was going down originally is, and there's a paper that documents this, right, is that we are so integrated in terms of our supply chains that some tiny little supplier that you've never heard of might be the key input in the automobile industry, right? And if you break that link, you break the automobile industry for at least as long as it takes to figure out how to replace that supplier, right? So there's all these little hidden landmines in the giant contraption that is a modern economy that it's we have to, again, I'm going to take this fundamentally conservative approach, which is, look, let's improve, yes, but let's do so very, very carefully, because what we don't want to do is break the machine, right? And break the machine in ways that leave us fundamentally worse off, right? And honestly, one of the biggest threats of tariffs is that they do break the machine. And they break the machine in a very specific and slightly terrifying way. Right, one of the bigger changes that this whole system, particularly the IEEPA tariffs, which are now out the window, was it basically said, under the arguments of the administration, which is the president has complete control over the economy. I can slap whatever tariff on whoever at whatever level I want, whenever I want. That's a system that is about as ripe for corruption as you can imagine, right? How do I get an exemption to the trade? I'm Switzerland. How did Switzerland get its tariffs lowered? Showed up in the office with gold bars stamped with Trump. Next day, 35, 15, right? It is a system where the powerful, those with money, all the CEOs who donated to the ballroom, what did they get in exchange? We don't get to know, right? Under a system where the executive has complete authority, right? And we have, as an economist, we have studied regimes like this ad nauseum, right? And again, I want you to imagine yourself in the future, right? Imagine but here, easier. Imagine yourself 15 years in the past. Try and think about what your income was, right? And maybe you can remember that. Maybe you're not numbers people. I want you to take and I want you to reduce it by 15%. That's the effect of regimes that have, autocratic control over the economy. That's how much their income falls long term. And you never get it back. Unlikely to ever get it back, right? So is 15% a lot to you or a little? To me, it's a lot, right? It's a big change in material well-being, right? So that's why, to me, this is not there's a tariff fight. And look, the initial papers on the effects of last year are basically that it's a wash, right? Because there's winners and losers in trade, right? So you have the first order effect of I pay higher prices, some importers pay higher prices, but there's also winners, right? The manufacturer who's being protected and the workers who get higher wages and the government that gets revenue, right? So there was a conference about a month ago where they had a big argument about whether this was slightly positive, slightly negative, or slightly larger negative. I don't think they were arguing it could be slightly more positive, but there's lots of uncertainty. But the first order effects are not, okay, trade is still only 10% of the economy. We're tweaking around the margins there. But it's the more fundamental, the uncertainty, the potential for corruption, that really starts to shake the foundations of prosperity in ways that we all need to be concerned about. And it also, there's, I think, potentially very lasting damage to international standing and reputation. We can already see that a little bit, thinking about things like tourism, which is really important in the Montana economy. It's really important, in fact, in the American economy. It matches up with any of our big industries. It's like right up there with like tech. Right, tourism's right there. Maybe not in the stock market in the same way as NVIDIA, but it's right up there with things like petrochemicals, aircrafts, pharmaceuticals, right? This is right there. The damage that we've done with our relationship with Canada, tourism is down year on year with 30%. This was last fall. This year it will probably be lower because people haven't, had time to not put their money down on a vacation coming up. We in Montana here, we had sort of just recovered from the pandemic, and now it's back down to right where it was in those very early recovery days. And this is something like this is damaging. We can see this in a lot of other ways as well, but just in like the day-to-day, the United States is in a very, very real danger of not having the same status, reputation, or being able to play the same role in the world. And again, that shows that does not just feel good, like, oh, we got to pat ourselves on the back because we're the Americans and people like us. Like, if they don't want to buy our assets, like, we will see financial effects in the financial markets. Now, it will maybe reduce our trade deficit, but we will suffer some other consequences, and we should acknowledge that and say, yeah, okay, we're okay with that before we pursue it. Should we move on to questions? Have a real policy debate about what the real effects and the real consequences will be. Yes, let's absolutely transition to questions.
Great. Well, we will start with a question here. I just want to say, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and it really rings true. When I look at my experience as a diplomat in Indonesia in the late 90s, people really wanted to buy American goods. People were excited to align with the US. And when you talk about tariffs as a foreign policy tool and some of the phrases you've used today, uncertainty has increased, there's a loss of power and influence, that cooperation is the key to prosperity. Today I saw a story in the New York Times talking about how Jakarta now is just consumed by Chinese products, Chinese cars, Chinese electronics, Chinese fast food, and that there is a decline in the engagement in McDonald's, in Ford, and all these things, and how will this affect us long term. So, who would like to start with the first question?
Particularly concerning other countries diversifying their trade and our general international standing, depending on whether or not we see, or whether we see a Democratic or Republican president in 2028, do you think we could return to a pre-Trump status quo?
we did, this is Olivia, who's a fabulous student in political science. We did not return to a pre-Trump status quo during the Biden presidency. And we need to have, I think, a really fundamental radical shift in party politics, party alignment, and a Congress that is committed to the power of the person lawmaking to see a real change. That's my perspective right now.
Yeah, no. What's the little Shrews reputation? Like, it takes decades to build, but it's gone in a moment. Something like that. Like, that's it. We will not recover the standing that we had 10 years ago, or whenever it is you want to peg this to. I would say it's unlikely in my lifetime. Worse, I think it's also unlikely that whatever tariffs that exist at the end of this presidency or whenever this administration ends, I think it's unlikely that they'll ever go away. The need for revenue is too high. And it's a regressive tax largely on low-income people, so it's likely to stick around.
Okay, so we'll go to a question online. It says, so who gets the $163 billion of tariff money sitting somewhere? Where is it and who gets it?
This is a great question. So right now, because the tariffs were declared illegal, there's a complicated and also costly process of returning it to companies. So the money is being returned to the companies that paid it initially, which I just want to point out that these trickle down, so right through. So the pass-through rate to companies is very high. It's over 90% estimated. And what percentage the companies are passing on to final consumer products is, I don't know that number.
Well, it changes, right? So
right,
essentially,
it depends,
what's happened is a lot of them have kind of delayed
right.
raising prices because they didn't want to raise prices, and so it's relative to normal tariffs. Or normal tariffs, like, you adjust pretty quickly. Because of all the uncertainty in this tariffs, it's been a little bit of a slower burn in terms of how much gets, the incidence gets passed on to consumers.
Yeah, so I just want to point out that when that money gets returned to companies, that money is not being returned to consumers who bought more expensive products. Maybe prices will go down.
Maybe you'll see a sale that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, but
That's
you'll never
right.
know it. Right? You will never know if you got any of the money back. Well, at least until some economist comes along and tries to figure out how to write a paper about it. But for the most part,
Bestseller paper.
yeah. So for the most part, is the website actually working? Like, it crashed the day that it was. This week was literally when you could start applying for these refunds, and so people tried to get onto the website and it was just not there. So maybe it's working, maybe there'll be some process, maybe some people will get some of the money back, but it's sitting in the US Treasury, or it's not sitting in the US Treasury. It's imaginarily it's digitally sitting in the US Treasury, and it will likely remain there until it gets spent out as, bombs for the Iran war, Social Security, or Medicare.
One of the interesting things that has happened over the last year is initially the tariff money, President Trump was like, well, I can use this for my various policy and other policies I want to do, which was not what happened. But then also in these framework agreements, many countries pledged very large amounts of money for investments into the United States. So for example, Japan promised to invest $550 billion, and the readouts, announcements from the Japanese side and the US side were different, and the Japanese side said, $550 billion, we're going to have these projects. About 60, 70 billion has been promised so far in projects related to like minerals and energy sectors and whatnot, and some pretty big projects. At the US side said, oh, this is like President Trump gets to decide where they go and gets to, have a controlling interest. They're like, oh, no, that's not what's going to happen. So there's even after these things happen, there's a lot of conflict, but there is a lot of, I think, really, really large amounts of money sort of floating around without clear understanding about where legal jurisdiction lies.
You've talked about the manufacturing sector from a national point of view. I wonder if you could talk about the agricultural sector from Montana's point of view. At least a year ago, there was a lot of concern about the effect of tariffs on the ag sector, but as you say, the rules keep changing, and I'm not quite sure where that is now.
Yeah, neither am I, to be honest. Look, if you're in agriculture in the United States, there's a very good chance that you are primarily exporting your products and you're exporting them to Asia. And a lot to China, but not exclusively. So in a world with tariffs and retaliatory tariffs, there's certainly limited market access. Then, we've certainly seen plenty of anecdotes, not just in Montana, but across the country in the ag sector about how hard it was hitting them. But everything keeps changing, so I don't know where we are at the moment with who's getting tariffed at what level in ag and how it's changing markets. It's probably not good, right? Because again, the way markets work, we all know this, right? Once I change where I'm buying from, there's a lot of inertia, right? So if I was buying lentils from somewhere in Montana and I suddenly am like, well, I can't do that anymore. I'm going to go buy lentils from I don't know where else they produce lentils. There's a good chance that they're going to stick with whoever they found, right? And Montanans are going to have to incur, not that they won't find other markets, but it just means that it's a tax, right? It's not a formal tax. I'm not writing a check to the IRS, but it's an effort tax. It's resources that I wouldn't have otherwise spent doing something that is a result of the government action, right? So I use this term effort taxes whenever I see those. I think they should be a much bigger part of our policy discussion, right? Because whenever the government makes me fill out a form, I'm dealing with an effort tax. And somebody needs to be counting up the effort taxes, right? And effort taxes around tariffs are an entirely different thing that we have not yet talked about. But they're a different form of tax that come from changing policy, and particularly changing policy in ways that we've done 90 different changes in less than a year and a half.
One of the things we do see with agriculture, market access for agricultural products has been a really big focus of Trump administration negotiations. And this was also true in the first Trump administration and the Biden administration and the Obama administration. And it's right, this is a really long-term thing. Thinking about access in both Europe and Asia. For Montana specifically, there's been a lot of beef about beef. And there have been some, these are written into the framework agreements that there'll be preferential buying for U.S. beef, for example, in the UK. There has been some loosening of regulations in Japan and South Korea with regards to that. But the question is the follow through. And we just don't have the data on that, or I don't have the data on that yet to see. Stepping a little bit outside of the boundaries of Montana, soybean farmers have really been nailed by the last decade of tariff frictions. And in the first Trump administration in 2018, when the first tariffs came on, the retaliatory tariffs from China immediately targeted districts that had shifted in votes from President Obama to President Trump. And soybean counties line up with those districts really well. And so they got hit with really high tariffs, and Chinese buyers, this was mostly for like livestock and whatnot in China, shifted their purchasing to Brazil and to South America. And so now that we even have these negotiations and these like purchase commitments and whatnot, it's like, great, we have these things on paper, but the effort was already taken. And so to move back and for it to ask businesses say, okay, I know you just set up this new business relationship, but now we want you to go back to the old business relationship. We promise you nothing's going to change. It's like a double effort tax, right? So we have to see how these things played out. It's definitely on the top of the agenda, but kind of too soon to say.
Okay, so we'll have one more question from the online audience and then have a final question for the evening from the in-person audience. Uncertainty of markets and cost of goods or manufacturing have historically been negative influences on the stock market. Do the panelists have an explanation for the current apparent strength of the stock market?
Yeah, we're in the midst of an enormous AI investment boom. And it's also worth noting that the US stock market, while strong, is actually weak relative to what's happening globally. So yeah, yes, the S&P is up, but if you had shifted from the S&P into some index of foreign stocks, you would have done better. So the uncertainty is definitely taking a toll in the market. The main place we're seeing it is actually in the dollar. The dollar is way weaker than expected. So that's where it seems to be manifesting itself mostly currently. But there's some, the stock market is trying to get at everything. And certainly there is an uncertainty tax lurking in there. But, profits are good. And so, and people think that AI is going to make profits even better.
And NVIDIA is really pulling up the market in general. If we take the NVIDIA chips out, our market is not performing nearly as well.
So I had a question about industrial policy and tariffs. Tariffs have been used quite frequently along with industrial policy. It's been used in Japan, South Korea. And the Biden administration also tried to do a version of that. They used tariffs in certain sectors along with some aspects of industrial policy. I had a two-part question because, the free trade models, the assumptions don't always hold for, the Stolper-Samuelson and the Hexa-Rollin and all those, the assumptions don't quite hold. So, which implies that in the long run, they predict some kind of Pareto optimality in the immediate term, but long run development, it gets all kinds of problems, as you indicated. So I had a couple of questions. One is that, why do you think, I guess as I'm asking you the question, I'm laughing to myself, but whatever. Why do you think that the Trump administration, avowedly, Trump campaigned on bringing back manufacturing jobs. Why do you think he abandoned some of the Biden policies that were working? He could have lied about it, as he does about a lot of things, but so he could have said, this is my policy, not Biden's policy, and then target sectors, and then use tariffs along with industrial policy. What is going on there? This is a political economy question, really. I had a second part, but I won't ask that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when I look at the sectors in my research that I pay really close attention to are minerals and things that people usually often call critical minerals, and many of the downstream things like magnets and batteries and green tech related things, and sometimes chips and things like this. And Biden, in fact, as you bring up, did have a series of industrial policies. And when I look at the sort of one-to-one, what Trump is doing compared to what Biden is doing, there's a lot of through lines between Biden era industrial policy and what we're seeing now. And we can see this, we used to have the Mineral Security Partnership with Biden, and now we have the Vault, which is a multilateral buy-in mineral stockpiling program, things like this. In fact, and some of the policies that were sort of introduced under Biden have been supercharged under the Trump administration. There has been some it's not exactly one-to-one, but I actually think that we do see a continuation of industrial policy, and we see it done much more in a way that's in line with historical industrial policy, with a higher level of government intervention compared to what we saw under Biden.
But it's imperfect, though, right? I think but it is, and there's certainly, I think that, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I take this as, look, what would make sense to some degree is to pair very targeted historical tariffs on very particular industries that you're saying, oh, we want to build this stuff, and we're gonna layer other industrial policy on top of that, and we'll kind of create a cluster and agglomerations, and yeah, we're gonna do some stuff there. And and you're right on the long-term parts of the trade. That's what I talked about earlier. It's an insurance policy, right? You're basically saying, well, there's all these risks in the future, and so we're gonna suffer some of the losses from day one of grad trade, where you literally prove that free trade makes people better off, the whole mathematical proof, into the more complicated versions where there's all these other things that are happening. And so you're saying, okay, well, we're gonna hedge some risk about that. And that's, and economists, when I was coming up, we hated this because we're like, how can government pick and choose the winners? We don't like that. In the past decade or so, there's a bit of pendulum swing back towards, yeah, we probably should have some industrial policy that kind of helps us avoid certain risks that the market isn't taking care of. But instead, what we're getting is, what we currently have is, so we have a bunch of the Section 232 national defense tariffs, but then we also have this 10% tariff on everyone, which is basically the exact opposite of targeting industries or whatever it is. And I cannot explain the political economy of that to you. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Thank you so much. And do you want me to wrap up?
Do either of you have any final remarks you want to make before I wrap up?
I have one final remark I want to make, which is that there are some things that the United States is really, really good at internationally, and we export far, far more than we import. And one of those things is education and higher education. And we have so many thousands of foreign students. We have a few in the room tonight as well. I'm really happy that you're here. And it is an industry, just foreign students in the United States is an industry that's larger than things like coal. And that's just the foreign students. And that's in terms of like money, like that it produces, certainly, but in terms of people that are getting jobs and whatnot, it's like 10 times more than coal. And when we think about like who we are as the United States and who we are in the world and who we are in trade, I think like thinking about this really human aspect and how we as a country can be a place that is welcoming and shines in that way is something that's a real strength.
I have said all the things that were on my mind, so I will let you all get back to your lives.
Well, so let me follow up on what Kristin said. You know, as a first-generation American, my father came here to pursue his education as well. And I was just in India, which is traditionally, well, more recently, is one of the biggest senders of students to the United States. The visa refusal rate in India is now 70%. So when you're looking at economic impacts in the United States, the loss of that student income, the loss of impacts to universities and communities, the loss of students who are more interested in STEM than a lot of American students, you are going to see some significant impacts in education. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's been a great audience, a mix of students, our usual community members, some really wonderful policy leaders and education leaders in the community. We have one more in-person event this year. Some of you may have seen our first Mansfield mural by Hadley Ferguson. The second of 3 murals will be unveiled on March 6th at 5:30 at the Mansfield Center.
May 6th.
Oh,
May 6th.
sorry, what did I say, March? Yeah. May, come in May, not next March, May 6th. And so we will have Dr. Paul Lauren speak. We will have a Mansfield descendant, Stephanie Shea, speak. Hadley Ferguson will speak. And the focus of this mural is Mansfield's work in the Senate, talking about Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, Medicare, a lot of the things that have circled back today. So I hope you'll join us for that. But I really want to thank our speakers. You make tariffs fun. So thank you for helping us understand them in some very basic language and bringing them home to us in our own individual households and in Montana. So let's give them another round of applause. Thanks to our online audience, and please stay and mingle and ask our speakers any questions that you did not get to pose earlier. Thank you.